On October 13, 1996, 35-year-old Sharon Lopatka left her Hampstead, Maryland home to travel to North Carolina. Sharon had told her husband Victor that she was traveling to Georgia to visit friends. 1 week later, Victor was surprised to discover a mysterious note written by his wife suggesting instead a bizarre, clandestine trip. Victor immediately called the police, who looked for evidence of Sharon's whereabouts on her computer. They found emails suggesting that Sharon had visited someone in Lenoir, North Carolina. On October 25, 1996, North Carolina police found Sharon's decomposing naked body buried a short distance from the trailer of the person she went to visit. Her hands and feet had been bound with rope, and a nylon cord had been strung around her neck. Investigators also found scrape marks around her neck and breasts. According to the Associated Press, the medical examiner determined that she died of strangulation, the violent death Sharon had wished for. Sharon Denberg was the oldest of 4 daughters born to Mr. and Mrs. Abraham J. Denberg in 1961. The family lived in a suburb of Baltimore, Maryland. Sharon Denberg's parents were devout Orthodox Jews who were active in the Beth Philo congregation. Abraham Denberg was, in fact, a cantor at Beth Philo, Baltimore's largest Orthodox Jewish synagogue. His daughter Sharon had been active in sports, sang in the school choir, and was perceived by classmates to be as normal as you can get, wrote the North Carolina News and Observer on November 3, 1996. In 1991, Sharon married Victor, a Catholic, and an Ellicott City, Maryland construction worker. Sharon's parents did not approve of the marriage. A former high school classmate told the Washington Post on November 3, 1996, that the marriage was Sharon's way of breaking away. Sharon moved with her husband to a small ranch-style tract house in Hampstead, Maryland, in the early 1990s. They had no children. Sharon began several small internet business ventures from her home to make some extra money. In her business, Classified Concepts, she rewrote ad copy for advertisers for $50 per ad. She also operated several other websites, where she sold psychic readings and advice. On the sites, Sharon would also post ads selling other services with a 1-900 number, for which she would receive a percentage of the revenue. Another way she made money was by advertising pornographic videos. Under the pseudonym Nancy Carlson, Sharon sold videos of unconscious women having sexual intercourse. According to the Augusta Chronicle on November 4, 1996, one excerpt from her ad from October 1, 1996, stated that she had just made a video of actual women, willing and unwilling to be knocked out, drugged, under hypnosis and chloroformed. Sharon even went so far as to advertise her own undergarments online, which read, "Is there anyone out there interested in buying my worn panties?" Sharon had no qualms about advertising and selling products that would appeal to the lurid sexual fantasies and fetishes of her customers. She also had her own sexual fantasies that she actively sought to fulfill. Sharon used the internet for a variety of purposes, such as to obtain business ideas and make money. However, she also used the internet to interact with a larger variety of people who shared her unconventional interests. She often ventured into hardcore pornographic chat rooms where subscribers would openly discuss their interests in necrophilia, bondage, fetishes, and sadomasochism. She used numerous pseudonyms and multiple personae in her internet messages. Using these masks allowed her anonymity and the freedom to pursue her unusual fantasies. According to the Washington Post on November 3, 1996, one message Sharon posted stated that she had a fascination with torturing till death. Some of the identities she assumed during the chat room sessions included a 300-pound strict dominatrix and disciplinarian, a screen actress named Nancy Carlson who would offer to star in customized sex videos for a price, and a shapely 5'6" beauty. The News and Observer found more than 50 such messages of Sharon's over several months. Many were found on internet sites such as fetishfeet.com and sexbondage.com. The overriding theme of Sharon's messages was that she wanted to be tortured and killed. Often she would post messages on the internet looking for a man to satisfy her wish. A sex rights activist named Tanith, who often visited the sites, told the Washington Post that she became concerned with Sharon's bizarre messages. On November 3, 1996, the Post quoted Tanith saying that Sharon was going to chat rooms and asking to be tortured to death. Tanith had tried to stop her, but Sharon refused. Sharon replied to the woman, "I want the real thing. I did not ask for you preaching to me." The Baltimore Sun learned that there were numerous responses to Sharon's messages offering to fulfill her fantasy. Most eventually withdrew when they discovered that Sharon's requests were serious. But there was one man willing to give Sharon exactly what she desired. Robert Bobby Frederick Glass was a 45-year-old computer analyst who worked for the Catawba County, North Carolina government. According to the Washington Post, Bobby was a productive worker who was responsible for programming tax rolls and keeping track of the gas consumption of county vehicles. He worked for Catawba County for almost 16 years. Bobby was also a computer enthusiast, according to Sherry, his wife of 14 years. But in an interview with the Washington Post, she lamented that he had more passion for his hard drive than his marriage. Sherry Glass stated in an interview that her husband had lost his attraction for her. Sherry said the final straw was when her children asked why their father didn't love her any longer. In May 1996, Bobby and Sherry separated. Shortly thereafter, Sherry moved from the family home with their 3 children, daughters aged 10 and 7, and a son, 6. It may have been more than a lack of love that caused the breakup of the Glass family. According to Sherry Glass, there were other marital problems that few had known about. Daily, Bobby had spent countless hours typing on his computer, and Sherry eventually became suspicious. One day she logged on and found worrisome emails saved on the hard disk. The messages, she told the Washington Post, which had been posted under the pseudonyms Toyman and Slowhand, alarmed her because of their raw, violent, and disturbing nature. After dinner one evening, she confronted her husband. Sherry later said that all of the color had drained out of his face. She realized that there was this side to him that was unknown to her. Despite this alarming discovery, Sherry recalled him as generally pleasant, hardworking, and amiable. In August 1996, Bobby and Sharon became acquainted while visiting various sexually oriented internet chat rooms. Bobby displayed a fetish for inflicting pain, whereas Sharon exhibited a desire to be tortured. In an email message to Bobby, Sharon asked him to fulfill her fantasy. She wrote to Bobby that she wanted to be bound and strangled as she approached an orgasm. Bobby responded to her message by describing in depth how he would fulfill her wish. Email correspondence between the two lasted for several months. An investigator of the Lopatka case, Captain Danny Barlow of North Carolina's Caldwell County Sheriff's Department, said, "If you put all their messages together, you'd have a very large novel." Police were able to recover almost 900 pages of emails from Sharon and Bobby's computers. On the morning of October 13, 1996, Sharon drove her blue Honda Civic to the train depot in Baltimore, Maryland, telling Victor that she was going to visit friends in Georgia. Instead, she boarded the 9:15 a.m. train to Charlotte, North Carolina. At about 8:45 p.m. that evening, she arrived in Charlotte, where Bobby was waiting. Together, they drove 80 miles from the station in his pickup truck to his trailer home in Lenoir, North Carolina. The events that followed later became a source of speculation among investigators. The Daily Telegraph reported that in the note that Sharon left for Victor, she said that she would not be returning and told him not to go after her killer. She also wrote, "If my body is never retrieved, don't worry. Know that I'm at peace." On October 30th, 1996, South Coast Today reported that after the police department's newly developed computer crime unit found substantial evidence in Sharon's computer linking her to Bobby Glass, police in North Carolina monitored Bobby's trailer for several days. It was hoped that Sharon would be found alive at his residence, but she was not seen during the stakeout. On October 25th, Judge Beal issued police a search warrant for Bobby's trailer. Investigators arrived at Bobby's home while he was at work. The property surrounding the trailer was littered with rotten garbage and abandoned toys. The interior was equally dirty and cluttered. Still, they found items belonging to Sharon, as well as drug and bondage paraphernalia, pornography, a pistol, and thousands of computer disks. 75 feet from the trailer, an officer discovered a fresh mound of soil. After digging only 2.5 feet beneath the mound, they found Sharon's decomposing remains. Caldwell County investigator D.A. Brown told the Washington Post that if the body had been buried in the woodlands behind the trailer, we would have never found her. That same day, police arrested Bobby at his workplace. According to Capitol News Service, The Lopatka case was the first time a police unit captured a murder suspect based primarily on evidence obtained from email messages. While in custody, Bobby was interviewed about the events surrounding the alleged murder of Sharon. He told investigators that for several days he and Sharon had acted out their violent sexual fantasies in his trailer. He confessed that Sharon had willingly allowed him to tie her up with rope and probe her with objects around the house. Bobby also admitted that Sharon allowed him to tie a rope around her neck and tighten it as she climaxed during intercourse. But Bobby claimed to have accidentally strangled Sharon to death, while in the throes of violent sexual play, according to his lawyer Neil Beach. Bobby was later quoted as saying, "I don't know how much I pulled the rope. I never wanted to kill her, but she ended up dead." The body of Sharon Lopatka was sent to Dr. John Butts, North Carolina's chief medical examiner. The autopsy report stated the cause of death as strangulation. Other tests showed some inconclusive evidence of sexual torture or mutilation. Butts believed that Sharon died 3 days after she arrived in North Carolina. In an interview with the Associated Press on November 1, 1996, Neil Beach said that the autopsy report supported his client's claim that the death was accidental. "It is hard for me to believe the woman was tortured for 3 days if the medical examiner of North Carolina couldn't find any indication of that. It's much easier to understand or picture an accident occurring during sexual activity than it is to conjure up an image of this man as a cold-blooded, premeditated killer," Beach said. Search warrant affidavits released by police stated that Sharon intended to meet Bobby specifically to be tortured and killed. Captain Danny Barlow considered a death under such circumstances to be deliberate, not accidental. According to police, the emails written under the pseudonym Slowhand, detailing how he was going to kill Sharon, provided further evidence that the death was premeditated. Bobby was charged with first-degree murder and held without bond in the Caldwell County Jail. On October 26th, Superior Court Judge Beverly T. Beal issued a gag order to those directly involved in the case. Regardless of the court order, the media obtained enough information to sensationalize the Lopatka case. Most of the news stories focused on the dangers of internet-mediated meetings. Sharon's death spawned debates and discussion groups worldwide. Many called for censorship of the internet to prevent such deaths and to protect children. Conversely, anti-censorship activists argued that the internet was a useful tool, allowing people to express themselves more freely and to voice their ideas, thoughts, and views in an open forum, often anonymously. The Mardi Gras phenomenon is a term used by psychologists to describe the ability to mask oneself and assume a variety of personalities, allowing one to speak and act freely with little or no consequence. This phenomenon is particularly prevalent on the internet, where users can express themselves freely and anonymously in online chat rooms and news groups. Sharon's death and the publicity surrounding the case led to an increased interest in understanding deviant sexual behaviors, especially sadism, masochism, and the use of asphyxia during sexual intercourse. Psychologist Richard von Krafft-Ebing first coined the term sadist and masochist to describe behavior in which sexual arousal was achieved through the infliction or reception of pain. According to Reber's Dictionary of Psychology, sadism is the association of sexual pleasure with the inflicting of physical and psychic pain upon another, including humiliation, exploitation, and debasement. Masochism refers to any tendency to direct that which is destructive, painful, or humiliating against oneself. Psychologist Sigmund Freud was the first to combine the two terms into sadomasochism in an attempt to emphasize the reciprocity of the use of pain during sexual intercourse. A controversial form of deviant sexual play practiced by some sadomasochists involves the use of strangulation. Sexual strangulation is referred to by the psychological community as a form of asphyxiophilia. Asphyxiophilia refers to the general practice of controlling or restricting oxygen to the brain by interfering with the breath directly or through pressure on the carotid arteries in order to achieve sexual gratification. Often, the hands or a tourniquet of some sort are tied around the throat during sexual intercourse to achieve a feeling of euphoria and elation, which accompanies a lack of oxygen to the brain. Supposedly, this can increase the intensity of an orgasm. According to the Deviance Dictionary, sexual strangulation practiced with a partner is a form of edge play, in which one's life is literally in the hands of another. Supposedly, the thrill lay in the danger and vulnerability associated with the activity. However, there have been cases in which such edge play had resulted in an unintentional death. According to the American Psychiatric Association, about 250 deaths occur every year in the United States involving strangulation or chokeholds during sexual activity. A large majority of these deaths have occurred during autoerotic asphyxiation, in which one restricts one's own oxygen during masturbation or solo play. Jay Wiseman of the Society for Human Sexuality says that only a few of those cases resulting in a death due to strangulation or chokeholds have involved sexual play with a partner. There are many theories to explain why some people participate in deviant sexual behavior such as sexual strangulation. One theory suggests that deprivation of normal social sexual contact or childhood trauma causes such behaviors. There are also theories based on physiological causes of deviant sexual behavior that focus on the relationship between sexual hormones and the central nervous system. Currently, there is no evidence that suggests that either Sharon or Bobby suffered from early childhood trauma, abnormal sexual experiences, or hormonal dysfunction. What makes their case exceptional is that Sharon ventured into the relationship with one apparent intention to die. Thus, Sharon was a suicidal masochist. However, she was not the first in history to seek out a willing participant who would fulfill a request to be strangled to death for sexual gratification. Knud Jürgensen wrote in 1995 about the 1791 case of composer Franz Kotzwara, who enlisted the help of a London prostitute, Susanna Hill, to assist him with his bizarre wish. After paying Hill 2 shillings, Kotzwara asked her to cut off his genitalia, a request the prostitute refused. Yet Hill did agree to fulfill Kotzwara's sexual wish of strangling himself with a rope. It was the first documented case of death by sexual strangulation. Hill was eventually arrested for Kotzwara's murder, but later acquitted when authorities learned that she was more or less an innocent bystander, unlike Bobby Glass, who more than 200 years later faced first-degree murder charges for the sexual strangulation death of Sharon Lopatka. The charge was eventually reduced to voluntary manslaughter. The case against Bobby Glass stretched on for 3 years following several lengthy delays. On January 27, 2000, Bobby pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, as well as 6 counts of second-degree sexual exploitation. The latter charges resulted from the pornographic material found on Bobby's computer. Bobby was sentenced to 36 to 53 months in prison for the manslaughter of Sharon Lopatka, and 21 to 26 months for the possession of a special kind of pornography. You know what I'm talking about. I'm just not allowed to say it here. He was sent to Avery Mitchell Correctional Institution in North Carolina. On February 20th, 2002, 2 weeks before his release, Bobby Glass had a heart attack. He was pronounced dead at 1:30 a.m. at Spruce Pine Community Hospital in North Carolina.
Those in Orange County, New York, who knew 16-year-old Paula Pereira couldn't help but like her. She was a bubbly, confident, carefree girl who performed well in school, enjoyed the company of her tight-knit group of friends as much as a good book, and was active in the church youth group. Paula never complained, even though she was known to have had an unhappy home life. Despite her normally cheerful demeanor, Paula's problems at home peaked in 1981, leading to her unsuccessful attempt at suicide by overdosing on pills. From that moment on, while on the bus en route to school, the kids mockingly called Paula Tylenol, but she refused to let the comments get to her. On many occasions, she chose to bypass the school bus altogether and instead hitchhiked to class. Though Paula's boyfriend begged her not to hitchhike because of the inherent dangers, she ignored his pleas, claiming that only nice people pick me up. Then, on March 1st, 1982, Paula thumbed a ride one last time. That day, she was feeling sick and left Valley Central High School early to go rest at her boyfriend's house. She hitched a ride from a Cornell University student driving home from spring break. She was never seen alive again. 18 days later, Paula's battered remains were found in a barren stretch of ground off Route 211 in Wallkill, New York. She had been brutally raped, sodomized, and strangled before being tossed into the marshy area off the side of the road. Even though police frantically tried to find her murderer, the case remained unsolved for almost 2 decades. Then, in 1994, the first break in the case occurred during a televised BBC interview in which convicted serial killer Michael Ross claimed responsibility for 2 unsolved New York murders. Michael suggested that one of the women he killed he disposed of in the area of Wallkill, New York. Police followed up on the case and determined that the woman Michael was referring to was, in fact, Paula. To support their conjecture, they obtained DNA samples for Michael, which were analyzed and compared with preserved evidence taken from Paula's clothes. The DNA samples were a match, and Michael was formally charged with her murder in the fall of 2000. Michael Ross was later quoted saying to police during an interview, "As soon as I saw Paula, she was dead." Paula was not Michael's first victim, nor would she be his last. In fact, before his capture in 1983, he would claim responsibility for the murders of 8 young women. Daniel and Patricia Ross's marriage was beset with problems from the beginning. The troubles began when Patricia, Pat, was in high school and became unexpectedly pregnant, which led to their forced union. Pat wanted no part of the marriage or of being the wife of a chicken farmer in Brooklyn, Connecticut. Yet, at the time, she had little choice. Michael Ross was born on July 26, 1959. He would be the first of 4 children born to the hapless couple over the space of 5 years. During Michael's youth, there was evidence that his mother, wrought with psychiatric problems, mentally and physically abused him. In fact, Pat purportedly became so psychologically unstable and volatile towards her children that she was admitted to a psychiatric institution on at least 2 separate occasions, and Daniel eventually became the primary guardian of the children. When Michael was 8, there was evidence that his teenaged uncle, who babysat him and formed a close bond with the boy, sexually abused Michael before committing suicide at the age of 14. Despite the trauma Michael endured, he managed to excel in school. He had a special interest in animal science and dreamed of one day owning his own farm. In 1977, after graduating from Killingly High School, Michael went on to study agricultural economics at Cornell University's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. While at school, Michael was socially active and joined several organizations, including the Alpha Zeta fraternity and the Future Farmers of America. Moreover, he became involved in several relationships with some beautiful young co-eds, one to which he became engaged. However, the relationships always ended in failure, and Michael's dream of the perfect family began to be crowded out by other fantasies, disturbing, violent, sexual fantasies. It didn't take long for his fantasies to spiral out of control. During his second year at school, Michael started to stalk young women. Eventually, his violent sexual urges took on a new dimension when he began raping many of the women he stalked. Amazingly, he evaded capture for a couple of years. However, in September 1981, shortly after his graduation, he finally landed himself in jail for assaulting a young teenaged girl. At the time of the incident, Michael was working as a management trainee for Cargill Inc. in North Carolina. During a business trip to Illinois, he kidnapped a 16-year-old girl, dragged her into the woods, and gagged her before being interrupted by the police in mid-activity. Michael was arrested for unlawfully restraining the girl, was fined $500, and put on probation. The police had no idea that the man they arrested and subsequently let go was responsible for not only assault, but something much more sinister. That May, the body of Zung Nok Tu, 25, was discovered in Fall Creek, located at the bottom of a gorge in Ithaca, New York. Initially, police believed that she committed suicide. Eventually, they realized that Zung was actually the victim of a brutal rape and murder. Michael's violent fantasies had taken a deadly toll, and Zung would be considered his first known murder victim. Following the murder of Zung, Michael tried to kill himself, but he didn't because he was too chicken to do it. Michael tried to convince himself that he would never hurt another person ever again, yet by that time, his compulsions had gotten the better of him. Michael was a man out of control and on the verge of a murderous rampage. On January 5, 1982, Michael abducted 17-year-old Tammy Williams while she was walking home from her boyfriend's house in Brooklyn, Connecticut. She was later found and strangled not far from where she disappeared. Michael was never suspected in the case and thus had the freedom to continue his killing spree, which resulted in the murder of Paula Pereira approximately 2 months later. In April 1982, Michael struck again, this time in Croton, Ohio, near to where he had found a new job at a local egg farm. At around midnight on April 2nd, Michael went to the home of a pregnant off-duty policewoman, claiming that his car broke down. He asked for a flashlight, which the woman supplied him with, and Michael left, allegedly to fix his car. Michael returned a short while later, asking if he could use the woman's telephone. He spoke briefly with the woman and told her his name and where he worked. After gaining the woman's confidence, Michael attacked her. The woman put up a courageous fight and managed to scare Michael off. She then promptly called her coworkers, who rushed to her assistance. After receiving a description of the assailant, his name, and where he worked, the police were able to locate Michael the next day. He was immediately arrested and charged with assault. He was bailed out of jail by his parents a little more than a month later and sent home to Connecticut for 16 days of psychiatric study. The psychiatric report shows that Michael was indeed suffering from psychological problems, which he blamed on the 1981 divorce of his parents. Surprisingly, even though he had a criminal record including 2 sexual offenses, there was little action taken to ensure that he remained under constant psychiatric evaluation or police surveillance. This allowed Michael the freedom to carry on with his murder rampage. On June 15, 1982, Deborah Taylor, 23, and her husband ran out of gas near Danielson, Connecticut, and split up to look for a filling station. While she was walking on the side of the road, Michael abducted and strangled her. A jogger found her skeletal remains approximately 4 months later. Michael was not initially suspected, but he would later be linked to the case. In August 1982, Michael finally appeared in an Ohio court for assaulting the pregnant policewoman. During the proceedings, he pled guilty to the charges, was fined $1,000, and served 4 months in jail before being let out on probation. The probation report suggested he make better use of his free time, perhaps by taking classes, starting a jogging program, or learning to fly, hoping the activities might discourage his violent behavior. The recommendation was shocking and pointless. It isn't difficult to understand that such activity would do little, if nothing, to deter a violent serial. Once out on probation, Michael went back to Connecticut and began working as a door-to-door insurance salesman. He was able to secure the job after lying about his criminal record during the application process. It's likely that he spotted his next victim while canvassing potential clients. On November 19, 1983, Robin Stavinsky, 19, disappeared while hitchhiking in Norwich, Connecticut. Joggers found her remains a week later near a local hospital. She had been raped and strangled. At the time of the discovery, investigators working on the case were able to link Stavinsky's murder with that of Tammy Williams and Deborah Taylor's because of the marked similarities between the cases. Most of the victims were of similar stature, had been sodomized, found face down, and strangled. It was becoming increasingly clear to the police that a serial killer was in their midst, yet at the time they had few clues as to the identity of the killer. Working with the evidence taken from the crime scenes, they worked frantically to put a face to the serial murderer. Then, on Easter Sunday, 1984, Michael committed his first double murder. 14-year-old friends April Brunet and Leslie Shelley from Griswold, Connecticut were walking home from the movies en route to a friend's house when Michael kidnapped them. When the girls' bodies were later found, it was clear that they had both been brutally raped and murdered in a similar manner as Michael's previous victims. 2 months later, Michael claimed his 8th murder victim. On June 13, 1984, 17-year-old Lisbon, Connecticut resident Wendy Baribeau was abducted in broad daylight. Witnesses claim that they last saw Wendy alive walking down State Highway 12, allegedly on her way to a convenience store. Her remains were found several days later. Like Michael's other victims, Wendy had been raped and strangled. However, unlike the previous murder cases, there were witnesses who say they noticed a thin white man with glasses driving a blue late-model Toyota following her the day she disappeared. It turned out to be the break investigators were hoping for. Detective Michael Malchuk, who worked on the Tammy Williams case, was assigned to chief investigator of Wendy's murder case. Malchik began his investigation by pursuing the car that witnesses claimed to have seen. Malchik printed out a list of 3,600 locally owned blue Toyotas that matched the description. Coincidentally, the first person on the list he visited on June 28, 1984, was Michael Ross. During the interview, Malchik immediately became suspicious of the young man. Malchik described the visit as a roller coaster ride because every time he was about to leave the apartment, Michael would drop him a crumb that would make him think that he should ask more questions. Eventually, Michael couldn't withhold his ghastly secrets any longer and confessed to some of his crimes. Initially, he told Malchik only of Wendy Barabo's murder, but then later, when in police custody, he confessed to also killing April Brunet, Leslie Shelley, Tammy Williams, Deborah Taylor, and Robin Stavinsky. It would be years before he would claim responsibility for killing Paula Pereira and Zung Nok Tu. In July 1987, Michael went on trial for Deborah Taylor and Tammy Williams' murders. He pled guilty to their murders and received a maximum sentence of 120 years. The following month, he was tried for the murders of Wendy Barabo, April Brunet, Leslie Shelley, and Robin Stavinsky, and was convicted. He received a total of 2 life sentences and 6 death sentences. During and after the trials, Michael became angered because he felt that the judge and jury were biased and the testimonies of some of the witnesses were grossly inaccurate. Yet, probably his greatest source of irritation was that he felt the court failed to recognize his alleged mental illness. Michael suggested that this was most evident when the judge disallowed testimony by psychiatrist Dr. Robert Miller. The defense team claimed that had Dr. Miller been allowed to submit his testimony concerning Michael's psychological state, the jury would have been more lenient during the penalty phase. Moreover, his mental illness might have even been considered a mitigating factor, which could have spared him the death penalty altogether. In protest, Michael filed a long list of complaints and petitioned the state for a new trial. After examining his case, the Judicial Review Council and the statewide grievance committee dismissed his complaints. However, Michael continued the appeals process, and eventually his case was taken to the High Court. In July 1994, the Connecticut State Supreme Court decided to uphold Michael's murder convictions but overturned the death sentences, finding that the original trial judge excluded evidence that might have helped Ross prove he suffered from a mental illness or defect. As a result, the court ordered a new penalty hearing, which would be delayed for several years. In the meantime, Michael battled his psychological problems and courted death. The earliest account of Michael's purported mental illness began when he was a little boy. As a child, he fantasized about women, about bringing them to a special underground place, hiding them, and keeping them to love him. He was further quoted as saying that as a teenager, he molested several little neighborhood girls, and as an adult, his fantasies grew more sexual and progressively more violent. Some believe that Michael's anger towards his mother was one of the primary contributors to his aggressive feelings towards women. However, it's also been suggested that his violent behavior was actually due to a hormonal imbalance in the brain. What's most likely is that it was a combination of both factors. In his writings from jail, Michael often described his sexual violent urges as a separate, uncontrollable entity that would suddenly take him over without warning and propel him to do things he knew were wrong. He wrote in a 1998 article titled, "It's Time for Me to Die, An Inside Look at Death Row," that his urges were like living with an obnoxious roommate that he could not escape because it was always present. He further stated that he would often get orgasmic pleasure from his fantasies and acting them out, yet he would also be disgusted later by the exact same thoughts. After relieving himself from his fantasies, he said he felt such a sense of loathing and self-hatred that he often longed for death to liberate him from his mental torture. A vast majority of the psychiatrists who treated Michael diagnosed him with a paraphiliac disorder known as sexual sadism. In his book, The Psychopathic Mind, Origins, Dynamics, and Treatment, Dr. J. Reed Malloy described sexual sadism as the conscious experience of pleasurable sexual arousal through the infliction of physical or emotional pain, which is characteristic in most sexual psychopaths. His psychiatrist made several attempts to reduce Michael's repetitive thoughts, urges, and fantasies of the degradation, rape, and murder of women, which he claimed he couldn't get out of his head. Michael said that the female contraceptives Depo-Provera provided some relief of his symptoms, and that they helped to reduce his testosterone levels to below prepubescent levels, further leading to a significant reduction in his violent urges and fantasies. However, the relief was temporary. Michael developed liver problems as a direct result of the hormones and had to discontinue using his medication. Soon afterward, he complained that the violent sexual urges re-emerged. A little more than a year later, Michael was given an alternative form of female contraception, which allowed him to regain control over sadistic impulses to attack women. The medication purportedly allowed Michael the clarity to grasp the full extent of his horrific crimes. Even though he claimed he could sparsely remember the details of the murders, he did begin to realize some of the agony he caused the families of his victims. He claimed in his article that he was haunted by their pain, but knew that there was nothing he could do to absolve what he did. Consequently, Michael decided to put himself and the families of his victims out of their prolonged state of misery by volunteering for execution. His controversial decision would be met with mixed reactions ranging from anger to relief, and caused a temporary upheaval in the system that was unaccustomed to prisoners seeking state-assisted suicide. Michael spent the better part of 4 years working with state prosecutors to circumvent a new penalty hearing and secure an agreement to proceed directly to the death chamber. On March 11, 1998, Michael signed a 10-page death pact with state prosecutor C. Robert Sadie, acknowledging his crimes were cruel and heinous, and pleading with the court to hasten his execution. However, a superior court judge decided to invalidate Michael's agreement with Sadie, declaring that it was unconstitutional and unsettling. The court further ruled that a new penalty hearing must be held, which was exactly what Michael wanted to avoid. The penalty phase retrial was scheduled to begin in April 1999 with the selection of the jury. That same month, Michael allegedly had a change of heart and decided that he no longer wanted to be executed. His team of defense lawyers planned to revert to their original strategy, which was to prove that Michael's mental illness was in fact a mitigating factor that would make him ineligible for a death sentence. The prosecution team wanted to push for capital punishment and intended to prove the existence of so-called aggravating factors. They would have to wait a long time before either side would be able to present their arguments. Approximately 10 months after jury selection began, and a great deal of legal wrangling, Michael's penalty hearing finally got underway. It took 3 days for the prosecution to present their case, which began with the testimony of the victims' relatives and police officers that investigated the murders, and ended with a videotaped BBC interview of Michael discussing how his victims suffered. Their arguments were powerful, as was the testimony of the victims' families, making it an even more difficult challenge for the defense team to sway the jury. The defense had their work cut out for them, but they too were able to present a strong case. The jury listened to testimony from Michael's prison psychiatrist, Dr. Stanley Kapuscinski, who stated that his client suffered from sexual sadism and that the symptoms were relieved by drug therapy. His statement supported the defense's contention that Michael's murderous rampage was provoked by his mental illness. Michael's father also took the stand and pled for his son's life. Daniel Ross said that he felt it would be a mistake to execute Michael Ross because he is a biological specimen that could ultimately provide valuable information into the psychopathology of a serial killer. Michael's aunt also testified on his behalf and asked that he be spared from the death penalty. Perhaps one of the most unexpected persons to take the stand in Michael's defense was Sam Reese Shepard, the son of Dr. Sam Shepard, who was convicted of killing his mother in Ohio in 1954. During his testimony, Sam openly opposed the death penalty and suggested that Michael would be of better use to science than he would be dead. Yet, the defense's defining moment was when they introduced Dr. Miller's testimony, which was barred from Michael's original trial. In a letter written to the court 13 years earlier, Dr. Miller suggested that Michael's mental state was a mitigating factor, which he believed should play a role in the type of penalty that was handed down to his client. Following the induction of one of their most important pieces of evidence, the defense made their closing arguments, then rested their case, hoping that the jury would agree with Dr. Miller's conclusion. After 9 days of deliberation, the Superior Court jury of 9 men and 3 women finally reached a verdict. On April 6, 2000, Michael once again received the death penalty for the brutal murders of April Brunet, Wendy Baribeau, Robin Stavinsky, and Leslie Shelley. Michael stood impassively as the verdicts were read, whereas the families of the victims wept or sat with bowed heads. It had taken the state a total of 16 years since Michael's arrest to secure a death sentence against him, and they were determined to make it stick this time. If the state got its way, Michael would be one of the first people to be executed in the state of Connecticut since 1960. In August 2001, while his death penalty sentence was pending appeal, Michael was extradited from his death row prison cell in Connecticut to the Sullivan County Maximum Security Prison in Fallsburg, New York. He was transferred to Orange County to face arraignment in the rape and murder of Paula Pereira. On September 24, 2001, Michael stood before Judge Nicholas DeRosa and pled guilty to the first-degree murder charges. The following month, he was sentenced to 8 to 25 years in prison for brutally killing Paula. Surprisingly, Michael expressed relief when the sentence was handed down and was quoted saying, "I regret that this has taken so long to be taken care of." Michael managed to evade being charged for the rape and murder of Zung Nok Tu in 1981. Tompkins County District Attorney George Dentes suggested that it was pointless to seek a conviction against Michael in her murder because he had already been sentenced to death in Connecticut. Besides, Zung's family in Vietnam had no interest in pursuing the case and would prefer not to relive the pain that had torn their family apart. The Connecticut Supreme Court ruled to uphold Michael's previous death sentence in May 2004, despite repeated appeals by his lawyers. The following October, an execution date had been set for January 26, 2015. Michael had decided to discontinue his 18-year-long appeals process and had instead accepted his fate. Finally, on May 13, 2005, Connecticut granted Michael Ross's request when it carried out its first execution in 45 years. The New York Times reported that, in defiance of public defenders and others who wanted to save him, Michael Bruce Ross chose to forego further appeals. Ross convinced judges he was competent, smirked at psychiatrists who said he was suicidal, and often seemed exasperated by his inability to reshape his image. "This was not an act of suicide by Michael Ross," said defense attorney T.R. Paulding, who helped Ross with his appeals. "It was a decision that required courage." Michael Ross was executed by lethal injection at Osborne Correctional Institution in Somers, Connecticut. 9 members of his victims' families witnessed his final moments. Ross chose not to make any final statement.
On September 4, 1989, Marie Bouchard went to check on her daughter, Joan Heaton, 39, and her 2 grandchildren, Jennifer, 10, and Melissa, 8, at their home on Metropolitan Drive in the Buttonwoods area of Warwick, Rhode Island. She was concerned because she hadn't heard from them over the Labor Day weekend. Marie's other daughter, Mary Lou, accompanied her to Joan's house. It was a visit that would change their lives forever. When Marie and Mary Lou went into the house, they found it unusual that no one answered the door when they called. They knew Joan must have been nearby because her car was still parked in the driveway, so they rang the doorbell several more times. Still, there was no answer. They decided to take a look inside the house. When they entered, they immediately knew something was terribly wrong. The interior was splattered with blood, and a putrid smell permeated the air. As they walked further into the house, they made a heart-wrenching discovery. They saw Joan lying beneath blood-soaked sheets in the hallway. Her oldest daughter, Jennifer, was lying nearby, and Melissa was on the kitchen floor. All 3 had been brutally murdered. Marie and Mary Lou were horror-stricken. Just days earlier, Marie had spent the day with Joan and her grandchildren shopping and enjoying time together. It was hard to imagine that they were all dead. The mother and daughter called the police soon after they discovered the bodies. Within moments, rescue workers arrived on the scene, followed shortly thereafter by detectives. The house was cordoned off, and an investigation of the crime scene began. Detectives were shocked at the savagery of the crime. Even the most seasoned investigators had difficulty holding back tears. All the victims had been stabbed multiple times with kitchen knives. The youngest child, Melissa, was stabbed so fiercely that one of the blades actually broke off in her neck. She also had her skull bashed in with a kitchen stool. Apart from the 57 stab wounds inflicted on her body, Joan was also bludgeoned and strangled. It was believed that they were murdered 3 days prior to the discovery. The heinous murders were the worst the city had seen in recent times. News of the triple homicide sent shockwaves through the little town. No one felt safe, and residents looked to the police for answers. Even though investigators had little to go on, they vowed to find the murderer. It was a promise they would keep. The Warwick Police Department had their finest working on the case. They were determined to catch the person responsible for the murders, and they worked day and night reviewing evidence and interviewing locals who might have information related to the crime. They also enlisted one of the FBI's top profilers, Greg O. McCrary, to assist in the investigation. McCrary stated in his book, The Unknown Darkness, that he believed the murderer was likely someone from the Heatons' neighborhood. Moreover, he suggested the crime was probably connected with another unsolved murder that took place 2 years earlier in Buttonwoods. The coincidences between the crimes were significant. In July 1987, Rebecca Spencer, 27, was found dead in her living room. She had been stabbed repeatedly with a packing knife. At the time of her death, she was preparing to move to another neighborhood. In both the Heaton and the Spencer cases, the killer used a weapon that was already present in the house. This presented strong evidence that the killer originally entered the residence for another purpose, such as to burglarize the house. It's likely that the intruder was caught unawares and murdered the eyewitnesses using what McCrary referred to as a weapon of opportunity. Robbers often burglarize houses they know. The more familiar you are with the contents of a house, the more successful your robbery will be. Consequently, burglars regularly choose to rob houses that are close to where they live. McCrary suggested that in both cases, the murderer likely entered the residences with the intention of robbing and probably was familiar with the houses and/or residents. Moreover, he believed the murderer lived in the Buttonwoods area because both crimes were committed 5 houses from one another. Another similarity between the cases was an unusual display of overkill. Joan and Rebecca were stabbed approximately 60 times each, and the children approximately 30 times. Due to the excessive nature of the crimes, it was highly probable that the same person committed the murders. McCrary suggested to investigators that the frenetic manner of the stabbing used to kill the Heatons likely resulted in the murderer stabbing his own hand. He told them that they should look for someone in the neighborhood with a cut or bandaged hand. McCrary's advice was of great use to investigators because it significantly narrowed the search for a suspect. They had a location in which to begin and a possible characteristic of the suspect. All they needed was some luck. On September 5, 1989, just 1 day after the bodies were discovered, investigators got their first real break in the case. Police detectives Ray Pendergast and Mark Brandreth were driving through a park near Buttonwoods when Pendergast spotted a familiar face. They stopped the car to talk to a neighborhood boy named Craig Price, 15, who Pendergast once coached in a local basketball program. Pendergast asked the youth if he heard about the murders. Craig responded with concern that he was aware of what had happened and that he had seen the bodies coming out of the house the day before. He lived just a few doors away from the Heaton family. During the conversation, Pendergast and Brandreth noticed that Craig had a bandage on his hand. Suspicious, Pendergast asked how he hurt himself. Craig claimed that he got drunk several nights earlier and punched his hand through a car window on Keeley Avenue. As the detectives pulled away, they could not help but wonder if Craig was telling the truth about his hand. Why would he admit to 2 police officers that he'd vandalized a car? It seemed unlikely that a teenager would commit such ghastly crimes as the Heaton murders, let alone such a good-humored and vivacious kid as Craig. However, the fact that the boy had a cut on his hand and lived on the same street as the Heatons was too much of a coincidence to ignore. It was something both officers felt compelled to follow up on, which they did. The detectives wrote up a report and began to investigate Craig's story. They learned that there was no police report of a car window being smashed in the area Craig mentioned. They also went to Keeley Avenue and found no evidence of glass on the street. The two detectives began to further doubt Craig's story. Craig became a viable suspect in the Heaton murders. Even though many in the department believed the officers were wasting their time investigating him, Pendergast and Brandreth decided to follow their gut feelings and pursue Craig as a lead. They just needed more evidence to support their theory. In the meantime, expert blood analyst Dr. Henry Lee was contacted by police and asked to examine the Heaton's residence for clues. He went to the house and analyzed the blood splatters and trails. During his investigation, he gathered vital clues from the crime scene, including a bloody sock imprint. Whoever left the imprint wore a size 13 shoe. Craig Price was not an average teenager. At age 15, he already had a history of offenses, including a record of breaking and entering, theft, peeping into houses, and using drugs. He was also known to have a violent temper. Police had been called to his house on more than one occasion to settle disputes in which he was involved. Investigators working on the Heaton case decided it was time to question Craig more thoroughly. They went to Craig's house and asked him to come with his parents to the police station, which they did. During questioning, Craig was asked more detailed questions about how he cut his hand. He maintained his story that he hurt himself while trying to break into a car. Investigators were not convinced and asked him to take a lie detector test. The following day, Craig submitted to a polygraph. He was asked questions relating to how he cut his hand. The test revealed that Craig was lying. It was the first big break in the case. Even though the polygraph proved that Craig was dishonest, however, it didn't prove that he was involved in the murders. Investigators needed more evidence. During interviews with Craig's friends and acquaintances, investigators learned that he ran with a gang of juvenile delinquents who were known to burglarize houses. More significantly, they discovered that Craig boasted about killing Rebecca Spencer. It was the first evidence they had connecting Craig to a murder. Investigators were quick to obtain a search warrant for his house. Detectives Kevin Collins, Arthur Anderson, and Tim Colgan organized a search team. They devised a plan to set up overnight surveillance of the house before actually going in to search the residence. They wanted to make sure Craig was there and didn't leave the premises. In the early morning hours of September 17th, detectives gave the signal to move in on the house. A team of officers, led by Collins, Anderson, and Colgan, rang the doorbell. Craig's father answered the door and was shocked to see the police on his doorstep. He had no choice but to let them in. The rest of the family, including Craig, his mother, and brother, were awakened and asked to sit in the living room during the search. They were all visibly distressed by the drama, except for Craig, who dozed off to sleep on the couch. It didn't take investigators long to find what they were looking for. While searching the shed behind the house, a trash bag was found full of incriminating evidence. Within the bag were several bloody knives from the Heaton household, along with bloodied articles of clothing, gloves, and other objects. Investigators woke up Craig and arrested him for the murders of Joan, Jennifer, and Melissa. Surprisingly, he seemed unaffected. Craig was ushered from his house to the police station with his parents in tow. He was booked, then interrogated about the murders. The detectives hoped Craig would come clean about his crimes. They got more than expected. During the interview, Craig amazed detectives when he immediately confessed to the Heaton murders. He described in detail the events of the fateful night, although his story periodically changed. Eventually, he became worn out and decided that it was easier to tell the truth. What came out of his mouth next stunned even the most experienced and jaded listeners and sent his father, John Price, to the men's room to vomit, rendering him unable to return. Craig's horrified mother stood by her son as he recounted the events that took place at the Heaton residence approximately 2 weeks earlier. He told his interrogators that his primary intention was to burglarize the house. He said that he found an open window in the kitchen, which he crawled through. He accidentally landed on a table, which broke, but, despite the noise, he continued in the burglary. He claimed that he walked through the residence looking for items to steal. He didn't realize that the noise had awakened Joan. She walked into the kitchen and spotted Craig when she turned on the light. In a state of panic, Craig said that he grabbed Joan, then beat and strangled her. Joan's screams woke up the children, who stumbled out of their beds to the hallway. Melissa ran to the kitchen to call the police, but Craig overpowered her. Craig tackled the girls to the floor, then went to the kitchen, grabbed some knives, and began to stab them all. During the attack, one of the girls bit Craig's hand. In a fit of rage, he bit the girl back on the face. Craig also bit Joan. Moreover, he smashed the youngest girl over the head with a stool when she continued to struggle against him. Craig didn't expect that the three would put up such a fight, but they did. They fought until they succumbed to their injuries. Craig said that during the murders, he had accidentally stabbed his hand. He removed the gloves he was wearing and tended to his injuries in the bathroom. He didn't realize that he left a trail of blood and sock prints behind him. Evidence collected from the crime scene was later found to support Craig's story. The blood analysis conducted by Dr. Lee showed that some of the blood samples matched Craig's blood type. Moreover, Craig's shoe size was the same as the sock prints. There was no doubt he was telling the truth. Craig further admitted to covering the Heatons' bodies with blankets, probably out of shame for what he had done. He then tried to clean up the crime scene with towels, but he feared that if he stayed too long, police would catch him. He quickly gathered the knives, gloves, and some of the bloody towels and sprinted from the scene. Craig said he immediately returned to his home several doors away. He confessed that he hid his blood-soaked clothes in a bag in the attic. Detectives were alerted to the evidence and later found the bag in the precise location where Craig said it could be found. Following Craig's detailed account of the Heaton murders, he surprised detectives again. When asked about Rebecca Spencer, Craig admitted that he also killed her. He was just 13 years old at the time. Craig had no difficulty remembering his first murder. He provided investigators with details of the night in question while showing little remorse for what he had done. After his confession, a wave of disgust mixed with relief passed over the detectives. 4 murders solved within the space of several hours was a rare break. Investigators working on the case were glad they finally had their man. They just hoped Craig would get what he deserved for the atrocities he committed, preferably a very long prison sentence. They would have a long wait. Craig Price had the law on his side. Despite the brutal murders he committed, Craig would never have to face a trial or serve prison time because he confessed to his crimes just weeks before his 16th birthday. According to Rhode Island state law, all the courts could do was hold him in a training school until his 21st birthday and no longer. Thus, after 5 years, Craig would be a free man with a clean record. The thought of Craig serving only 5 years for 4 brutal murders enraged the citizens of Rhode Island, especially the families of the victims. It was obvious that the law was working against them. However, at the time of Craig's offense, teenage serial killers below the age of 16 were a rare phenomenon. In fact, Craig was considered to be one of the country's youngest serial killers. Even though Craig could not be tried for the murders, he still had to undergo a court hearing before he could be placed in the training school. On September 21, 1989, Craig appeared before Judge Carmen R. DiPetrillo at the Kent County Courthouse. During the brief proceedings, Craig was presented with the murder and burglary charges against him, to which he pleaded guilty. Craig was ordered to serve 5 years at the Rhode Island Training School's Youth Correctional Center, or YCC, a maximum security detention facility. He was also ordered to undergo intense psychological examination and therapy. However, Craig refused treatment. Moreover, he refused to officially discuss the murders at all by pleading the Fifth Amendment. Craig withdrew from the diagnostic and treatment program arranged by the judge on the advice of his lawyers. According to court documents, the reasoning behind the decision was based on fears that the psychiatric examination might result in his being placed in a psychiatric facility for commitment beyond his 21st birthday. Despite court intervention, Craig stuck to his guns and refused to submit to any psychological measures. In the meantime, Craig carried on with life within the institution. He completed his high school equivalency test and began taking satellite college courses. He believed he needed to improve himself academically so that he could get a good job when he was let out of the YCC. By 1993, Craig developed a reputation for good behavior within the training school, despite the fact that he refused treatment. In fact, he was in such good standing that his superiors granted him permission to counsel other youths at the facility. Moreover, Gina Macris suggested in a 1993 article in the Providence Journal that Craig also performed light security duties, which included patrolling the school's hallways. Craig was even allowed to make a rap video at the school, which included threatening lyrics. When the news broke of Craig's special treatment at the facility, Rhode Island citizens and the families of the victims demanded that it be stopped. After much protest, it ended, but the bigger problem still remained. Time was running short, and Craig's release date was steadily approaching. There were less than 1.5 years to work out a way to prevent him from being freed. 4 figures were instrumental in the campaign to stop Craig's release. They were Joan Heaton's mother, Marie, her sister, Mary Lou, Captain Kevin Collins, who led the Heaton investigation, and Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Pine. From the beginning, they lobbied the Rhode Island legislature to institute new bills to prevent Craig's release and others like him. Moreover, they went out of their way to inform the world of Craig's crimes and his upcoming release. Together, they tried every possible avenue to prevent Craig from having the chance to murder again. In 1990, Pine and Collins were key figures in instigating the passing of the O'Neill Bill, which toughened sentences on teenage murderers. In 1993, Pine introduced a controversial bill that would give the Office of the Attorney General the power to civilly commit a mentally ill individual to a mental institution if the person posed a danger to society. Many thought the bill would discriminate against the mentally ill and give those with psychological problems a bad name. It was also argued that the bill specifically targeted Craig and could be used to prevent him from ever being freed. Pine stood his ground. His main interest was making sure Craig stayed locked up for as long as possible. Pine said, "I will do everything I can to prevent another tragedy." Much to his delight and that of the families of the victims, the Craig Price Bill was passed that same year. It was a huge step, which they hoped would result in Craig being forced to submit to a psychiatric diagnosis and treatment program. In October 1993, Collins organized Citizens Opposed to the Release of Price, or CORP. The nonprofit organization concentrated on raising funds that would be used to increase public awareness about Craig's crimes and assist with lobbying efforts. The goal was to get critical bills passed that would prevent Craig from being released. Marie and Mary Lou also helped lead the growing campaign. They traveled throughout the state, alerting the general public about Craig's upcoming release. According to a Time article by Jill Smolo, the group worked endlessly, rallying to get funding, petitions signed, and information to the public, hoping to make Price's name a household word. Within months, the organization attracted hundreds of volunteers, raised tens of thousands of dollars, and gained national attention. In the interim, Craig was preparing himself to begin a new life. By the end of the year, he had already been ordered on 6 occasions to adhere to mandatory psychiatric evaluations and therapy. Nonetheless, he continued to refuse for fear that he would be forced into a mental institution after his 5 years at the training school. However, his days of hiding behind the Fifth Amendment were numbered. In May 1994, President Bill Clinton flew to Providence, where he was scheduled to meet and discuss state affairs. Thousands of demonstrators and a circling airplane that carried the banner, "Alert, Killer of 4 Craig Price moving here," greeted Clinton as he arrived in the city. It was clear that the citizens of Rhode Island wanted something done about the Craig Price matter, and they were not going to give up until the problem was solved. In a televised interview, Clinton expressed his dismay about Craig being let out in approximately 6 months. He suggested that the records of juvenile offenders should not be sealed but publicly accessible. He also mentioned that the laws needed to be changed to prevent juveniles with a violent history from purchasing firearms. Just 15 days after Clinton aired his comments, Rhode Island lawmakers reviewed bills concerning public access to juvenile criminal records and juvenile gun laws. However, the problem concerning Craig's release was still unanswered. Craig's luck was about to change. On June 8, 1994, Rhode Island residents were shocked to learn that Craig was indicted on one count of simple assault and extortion for threatening to injure Officer Mark Petrella, a training school employee. 1 week later, Craig was arraigned and bail was set at $500,000. His trial was scheduled for later that fall. That same month, Craig faced another problem. His refusal to submit to psychiatric examinations and therapy had gone on too long. He was warned that he was in danger of being held in contempt of court if he failed to undergo treatment. Yet, he would not sway. Craig's hearing took place on June 27th at the Providence County Family Court before Judge S. Jeremiah Jr. During the proceedings, Craig was again ordered to undergo a psychiatric exam, but his answer remained the same. The judge found him in civil contempt and added an extra year to his incarceration to be served at the Adult Correctional Institution in Cranston, Rhode Island. The only way that Craig could reduce the sentence was by submitting to the court order. After almost 5 years, Craig finally complied with the order and agreed to undergo a psychiatric assessment. Dr. Barnum, a forensic psychiatrist and former head of the Boston Juvenile Court Clinic, led the evaluation. Even though Craig participated in the assessment, he didn't do it wholeheartedly. In fact, it was discovered that he lied about many of the events concerning the murders. It was a matter that would later be addressed by the family and district courts. In the meantime, all eyes were focused on the upcoming trial. On October 3, 1994, Craig's trial began at the Superior Court in Providence. It was a long-awaited showdown that held the media and county in suspense. A majority of those who packed the courtroom were anxious to see if justice would finally prevail. They wouldn't have to wait very long. Overhearing the case was Judge Thomas Needham. Attorneys Robert Mann and Katie Hines led the defense team. Prosecutor Patrick Youngs and Mike Stone represented the state's case against Craig. The hushed courtroom listened intently to the opening statements made by Stone as he ushered in one of the state's most highly publicized trials. He told jurors that they would learn how Craig verbally assaulted Petrella after he was given a disciplinary report to sign for possession of contraband material, cigarettes, and a lighter. Moreover, they would hear how Craig threatened the officer if he continued his job at the facility. The prosecution planned to introduce 5 witnesses. Mann's statements followed those of the prosecution. When he addressed the jury, he didn't deny that Craig was angry at Petrella's report or that he used inappropriate language during the confrontation. However, he stated that he would introduce witnesses that would prove that Craig never assaulted or extorted Petrella. After the opening statements, the prosecution called the first witness, Mark Petrella. For 2 hours, Petrella gave a detailed account of the confrontation and how Craig verbally attacked him using profane language and then threatened to snuff him if he ever returned to work. He also said that several officers witnessed the incident and tried unsuccessfully to calm Craig's increasingly volatile behavior. Jurors also heard the testimony of 4 other witnesses who worked at the training school. Their stories agreed with Petrella's account. At the end of the day, the state rested its case, pleased that it had gotten their point across and the facts had not been contradicted. The next day, as the proceedings were set to continue, Mann asked to excuse the jury so that he could address the court alone. Once the jury had left, Mann asked the court for an acquittal based on insufficient evidence. The judge denied the request and ordered the continuation of the proceedings. As the trial commenced, the defense team introduced Antoine Carter as their first witness. Carter was an employee at the training school who witnessed the argument firsthand between Petrella and Craig. During his testimony, he claimed that he never heard Craig use the word snuff against Petrella. Moreover, he suggested that he didn't take any security measures during or after the incident because he didn't believe the dispute was a life-threatening situation. However, during cross-examination by the prosecution, Carter contradicted himself by indicating that Craig's actions were threatening. The defense's case was weakened by Carter's statement. They decided it was time to bring on another witness who worked at the facility. Yet, when the man took the stand, he also suggested that Craig acted in a threatening way towards Petrella. The defense's case began to fall apart. The next day, Mann decided to let Craig testify on his own behalf. It was the moment everyone waited for. All eyes turned their attention to Craig when he recounted the argument he had with Petrella. Craig told the jury that after the cigarettes and lighter were found in his possession, Petrella gave him the impression that he would not report the incident. He suggested that he was surprised and then angered when Petrella presented him with the disciplinary report later that day. He admitted to shouting profanity at the officer, but denied having ever threatened to snuff him out. Craig believed that Petrella's report was part of a conspiracy to keep him locked up. During cross-examination by the prosecution, Craig flew into a rage, claiming that everyone lied to get him in trouble. He told awed listeners that he was the only honest person who had taken the stand during the trial. In fact, he accused prosecutors of being at the head of the conspiracy to put him behind bars permanently. Craig's outburst marked the end of the trial. Both the defense and prosecution teams prepared to present their closing arguments for the following day. By the time the news of Craig's testimony hit the stand, many believed that his hope of attaining freedom was a lost cause. It was only a matter of time. On October 6, 1994, the defense and the prosecution teams presented their closing arguments. Following brief but powerful arguments, the jury retired to deliberate on the case. It would take them a day to reach a decision. The next afternoon, the jury returned their verdict. Craig was found guilty on both counts of extortion and simple assault. When the verdict was read, those listening seemed to feel that what he was really found guilty of was the long-ago murders. Relief spread throughout much of the courtroom as fears of Craig returning to society rapidly diminished. That December, a hearing was held to determine Craig's punishment. Judge Needham sentenced him to 15 years, 8 of which were suspended, at the Adult Correctional Institution in Cranston. Craig's problems weren't over yet. According to a 2004 article in the Providence Journal, Craig bit a correctional officer's finger during a brawl in February 1996. The article stated that prosecutors took the uncommon step of charging him for probation violation, even though he was still imprisoned. He was also charged with assault. Craig was found guilty of the accusations and sentenced to an additional year in prison. The next year, Craig was placed on trial for criminal contempt because he failed to comply with the psychological evaluations ordered by the state. The charges against him stemmed from complaints from psychiatrists who claimed that he lied about the events surrounding the murders. During the trial, Craig admitted to the charges and he was eventually found guilty. According to court records, Craig received an additional 25 years on top of his other sentences. 10 of the years were to be served outright, with 15 years probation. In October 1998, 7 more years were added to Craig's sentence for assaulting a correctional officer. It would not be his last time. In February 1999, and again in October 2001, Craig was sentenced to a total of 4 more years for again verbally and physically assaulting correctional officers. Price was denied parole in March 2009, and his release date was set for May 2020. In 2004, he was transferred from Rhode Island to Florida to serve his time due to his violent tendencies. In Florida, on July 29, 2009, Craig was involved in a prison fight with another inmate. While trying to break up the fight, one of the correctional officers was stabbed in the finger by a handmade shank in Price's possession. In the wake of the prison fight, Price had been transferred to another facility. On April 4, 2017, Price was accused of stabbing fellow inmate Joshua Davis at the Suwannee Correctional Institute in Live Oak, Florida, with a 5-inch homemade knife. On January 18, 2019, he was sentenced to 25 years for that crime. And this is how you keep a murderous juvenile in prison forever.
34 passengers on board Greyhound Bus 1170 were sleeping or sitting peacefully on an otherwise uneventful bus ride that fateful evening of July 30th, 2008, as it rumbled along a route from Alberta to Winnipeg, Canada. The long 15-hour bus ride should have been a benign and uninteresting ride intermixed with some sleep, cigarette breaks, and a few stops along some desolate country towns in between the two cities. Unbeknownst to the passengers of Bus 1170, a man by the name of Vince Lee would board the bus along its route. The unassuming Asian man wearing sunglasses did not stick out at all. However, the peace and tranquility of the night would soon be broken when Lee unexplainably pulled out a knife and stabbed the man next to him to death. The details of the grisly crime and the subsequent fallout from Lee's trial would forever change the Canadian public's discourse over the treatment of mental illness in the country's justice system. Caught in between the warring sides of those wanting maximum punishment versus recognizing the humanity of the mentally ill were both the family of Lee's victim, Tim McLean, and Vincent Lee himself. When Tim McLean boarded Bus 1170 in Alberta around midnight on July 30th, 2008, he was headed home to Winnipeg after working the carnival in Alberta. 23-year-old Tim McLean was described by his friends and family as a free spirit. He never liked to stay in one place for too long, and he always wanted to move around, experience new places, and work new jobs. Working at the carnival in Alberta was perfect for him since he got to interact with many different people during his job as a carnival barker. Carnival barkers are the people that entice carnival goers into playing the game they're operating. The job gave Tim the freedom he liked to express himself and have fun while meeting new people. But the days were long, and Tim was tired. Once the carnival had finished, he decided to head back home for some much-needed rest. After getting on board the bus, passengers noted that by the evening of July 30th, Tim was fast asleep. Sitting near the back of the bus, about one row ahead of the toilet, Tim had his headphones on and had his head leaning up against the window as he slept. Unbeknownst to him, at about 6:55 that evening, the bus made a regularly scheduled stop in the small town of Erickson, Manitoba. Here, the bus picked up a new passenger, Vincent Lee. When Lee first got on the bus, he sat near the front. Beyond sporting a pair of sunglasses at night, the 44-year-old Lee was otherwise unassuming. After taking his seat near the front, he sat quietly for about an hour until the bus pulled over to the side of the road for a scheduled smoke break. A lot of the passengers stepped off to smoke, including Lee. According to a passenger who spoke with Lee during this break, he was calm and polite. He spoke with Lee, and Lee also struck up some small talk with a female passenger. The passenger did not remember what they spoke about, but said it was unassuming and definitely not odd or weird. Once the passengers had finished smoking their cigarettes, the bus driver shepherded them back on to continue their journey towards Winnipeg. But once Lee was back on the bus, instead of sitting in the same seat towards the front, he chose to sit all the way in the back next to Tim McLean. At this time, it's disputed whether Tim was asleep or not. Some people claim that he did wake up and greet Lee. Others said that he stayed asleep the whole time. Regardless of whether he woke up or not, every passenger unequivocally agreed that there had been no dispute between Lee and McLean, or anyone else for that matter. All the passengers were calm and just trying to get home after a long bus ride. But that calm would be shattered about 30 minutes after stopping for that smoke break at 8:30 p.m. that night. At 8:30, without any warning whatsoever, Lee stood up and pulled out a large hunting-type knife. Without saying a single word, he started stabbing McLean repeatedly in the neck as he slept. The passenger that sat right in front of Lee saw the whole attack unfold. According to him, Lee did not say or do anything prior to standing up and pulling out the knife. Even during the attack, his face remained stoic, and he did not make a sound, not even as much as a grunt as he plunged his knife into McLean's neck about 8 or 9 times. As soon as the attack started, this man ran forward to get the bus driver's attention. Even though Tim was now screaming in agony, most of the passengers were asleep and not paying attention to what was unfolding around them. The bus driver quickly obliged and pulled the bus over to the side of the road. Once pulled over, the same man turned to see if he could assist Tim in any way. Why he would do this is because this passenger was a veteran and had served in the Canadian Army. He felt he had the training and experience necessary to take Lee down. However, after advancing towards Lee, Tim stopped screaming. Quickly realizing that he was dead and could not be saved, the passenger fled with the rest of the bus's occupants onto the side of the highway. While all of this was unfolding, a long-haul trucker saw the bus pull over and all of its passengers spill out. Quickly realizing that something was not right, he pulled over and went to see if he could offer any assistance. Upon meeting the unnamed Army veteran, the two, now joined by a third man, decided to try to subdue Lee before police could arrive. Arming themselves with a crowbar and 2 knives, the trio returned to the bus. Once back on the bus, they saw Lee had started to cut Tim's head off and had already sliced his abdomen open. When Lee saw them, he immediately charged towards the men. The 3 soon realized that Lee was not going to stop anytime soon and decided then and there that the best plan was to lock him inside the bus. After retreating outside, the men held the door shut while the bus driver attempted to lock it. While they were doing this, Lee stuck his arm through the doors and slashed at them with the knife. Though powerful, the men were stronger and were able to get the doors shut and locked. Lee then tried to get into the driver's seat and drive away in the bus. However, the bus driver was able to kill the ignition on the bus remotely, so Lee could not do so. After being locked into the bus, Lee then went back to Tim's body. He continued stabbing and slicing at it until he had severed his head. Then, in full view of all the passengers, he walked towards the door with Tim's head in one hand and his bloody knife in the other. Without saying a word and with a completely expressionless face, he dropped his head onto the floor and continued mutilating his body. Upon seeing him drop the head, some passengers became instantly ill, while others looked away in horror. Soon afterward, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived on the scene and formed a perimeter around the bus. They took the passengers away to a safe area while armed officers negotiated with Lee. The negotiations with Lee went nowhere for the next 4.5 hours. Lee continued to mutilate Tim's body and professed to the RCMP that he would stay on the bus forever. But for Lee, forever must have meant just a few hours, because at around 1:30 in the morning, he broke a window and climbed out of it. Once on the ground, police tackled him and tased him several times before subduing him and bringing him into custody. Upon his arrest, Lee was covered head to toe in the victim's blood. He also told the police that he was sorry and asked them to kill him. Even though Lee was a horrific enough sight on his own, it was what police found and did not find later on that proved the most haunting aspect of this case. Beyond severing Tim's head, his body had over 100 different stab and cut wounds. He was disemboweled, and pieces of flesh were found stuffed inside plastic bags throughout the bus. Inside Lee's pockets, police found Tim's tongue, nose, and an ear. After recovering all his body parts, police realized that Tim's eyes and a chunk of his heart were unaccounted for, and police presumed that Lee had eaten them. Soon after the details of the grisly attack became public, Lee became an international media sensation. The main question on everyone's mind was not whether he did it or not, but why. To answer that question, police and prosecutors would have to analyze every aspect of the life of a very sick, but otherwise quite average and decent man. Vincent Lee was born in China in 1964. After obtaining a computer science degree from Wuhan Industrial University in 1992, he worked as a software developer in Beijing from 1994 to 1998. In 2001, he legally immigrated to Canada and became a full Canadian citizen in 2005. During this time, he married a woman only known in public records as Anna. It's unclear whether they met in China or Canada and what her nationality was. The only thing for certain is that by the time of the attack, the two were divorced but still living together amicably. At first glance, the attack appeared to have all the hallmarks of someone who was severely mentally ill. Because of this, police specifically looked into his background to prove if Lee had a mental illness or any type of criminal background. While Lee had an absolutely spotless criminal record, there was some evidence of mental illness. In 2003, Lee was picked up walking on the side of the highway in Ontario. When responding officers asked him what he was doing, he said that he was going there to look for work. It's unknown what made the police suspicious of his behavior, but they had him involuntarily committed to a mental health facility in Ontario for evaluation. After an unknown but probably short period of time, Lee left the hospital against a doctor's recommendation to stay. Upon his return home, Anna asked that he seek treatment, but Lee refused. Beyond this one incident, there are no other documented cases of interactions with the police or being treated for mental illness. According to his bosses at Walmart and a restaurant where he had worked, Lee had always been a good worker and dependable, though he had kept to himself. His ex-wife was able to see more of his challenges with mental illness at home. She reported that he often had trouble sleeping and eating. She said that he sometimes would take long bus rides without notice and wander to who knows where. Lee apparently even once broke down crying to her, stating that he had seen God. While certainly a cause for concern, when Lee pushed back against getting treatment for his mental health, she relented. Lee's mental health must have continued to decline since that July. He was let go from his job at Walmart. While some sources cited that he had a disagreement with an employee, people may never know the real reason. But what is known is that during interviews with psychiatrists, Lee stated that during this time he began to hear voices in his head. Eventually, these voices told him that he needed to leave Edmonton, where he lived with his ex-wife, and move to Winnipeg in search of work and a new life. Before he left, he wrote a note to her stating that he was done and he was starting a new life. At noon on July 28th, he boarded a bus in Edmonton and rode it until the following evening on July 29th, when he got off at a rural town named Erickson in Manitoba Province. After getting off at the bus stop, he spent the next day sitting on a bench. When not sitting down, Lee burned some of his clothes, threw some in the trash, and tried to sell others. The following morning, he put his laptop on the sidewalk next to the bench with a for sale sign of $600 or best offer. A local resident walked past the man several times and decided to inquire about buying the computer. According to him, he haggled with Lee over the price. The two eventually agreed on a price of $60, and the man went to the bank to withdraw the money. After buying the laptop, the boy took it home and soon realized he did not have the password. Going back to Lee for it, Lee readily gave him the password. After taking it back home, the teenager's mother looked through the computer with him to ensure that there was not any pornography on it. Instead, the pair found just a few job resumes, emails written in Chinese, and a bunch of nature shots that looked like they were of British Columbia. While seemingly innocuous, the interaction between Lee and the boy is important because it's further evidence of Lee's state of mind. Lee was friendly and not aggressive at all, and neither was he rambling or unaware of what was going on around him. Instead, he just made simple, pleasant conversation with the boy. His actions also helped support the manic episode Lee was suffering at the time. Even though he said he wanted to start a new life in Winnipeg, why Lee would be getting rid of all his possessions directly contradicts this intent and proved he was not in the right state of mind. Later, when the teenager was back in the same area, he saw a Greyhound bus departing, and the man was gone. Little did he know that he had just witnessed the beginning event of what was to come not even 2 hours later. Once in police custody, Lee was charged with second-degree murder. The government did this because the police knew from the beginning that his mental state was in question. In order for first-degree murder to be charged, prosecutors would have to prove intent was there from the beginning. But with second-degree murder, that burden of proving premeditation was not there, since someone who is mentally ill could not have that capacity. Before prosecutors knew that the case would center solely on Lee's mental competency, both the state and defense opted to have psychiatrists examine Lee. During his interview with them, Lee stated that voices in his head told him that Tim McLean was an evil demon that was going to kill him and other people, and the only way to save his life was to kill the demon. When explaining why he mutilated the body to the degree that he did, Lee said that the voices told him McLean's body would be able to reanimate and that he had to dismember it to stop that from happening. In a rare turn of events during his competency trial, both psychiatrists diagnosed Lee as suffering from a severe case of schizophrenia, that he was also suffering from delusions, and that the manic episode he was going through at the time of the attack was still going on. Due to the overwhelming evidence of his mental illness, the judge ruled that Lee was not criminally responsible and would be admitted to a mental institution. While Lee's being found not criminally responsible, known as NCR in Canadian courts, should be no surprise to anyone. What caused all the outrage was the public at large becoming aware of how the Canadian criminal justice system looks and treats a finding of NCR. In Canada, a successful finding of NCR means that a person did, in fact, commit the crime, but due to such severe mental illness, they cannot be held responsible for their actions. This is because most crimes include two parts. First, the accused must commit the actual act itself. Second, the accused must have the intent to commit the act. Because severely mentally ill people cannot form the proper intent, they should not be held criminally liable for their actions. Instead, under Canadian law, those found not criminally responsible are sentenced to an indefinite term in a Canadian mental institution. Under the law, those admitted patients are forced to undergo strictly regimented and regulated psychiatric treatment. Those who respond well to treatment and follow their doctor's orders are given good evaluations that could help them get released. Those who do not do well or refuse treatment will continue being treated for up to the rest of their lives. For patients like Lee, their only hope of release would be at a board made up of a psychiatrist, a lawyer, and another member who is neither a lawyer nor a psychiatrist. The board reviews all aspects of a patient's record and makes recommendations as to different privileges they can be granted, like supervised walks around the facility, all the way up to full release. Upon hearing the judge's finding that Lee was not criminally responsible, McLean's family was outraged. His family and their supporters argued that despite how severely mentally ill Lee was, a crime was a crime, and he should be locked up for life regardless. People on the other side of the argument stated that those who were severely disabled should get the proper treatment they needed to reintegrate back into society. Their point of view has been that Canada, like most other countries, has treated those with mental illness as pariahs and as people who should be locked away and forgotten. Canadian legislation that found citizens not criminally responsible was a step in the right direction toward helping those who truly needed it. Detractors of that argument stated that the law did not do enough to give justice to a victim or their families. Because of this, the battleground over mentally ill prisoners in Canada flared up with McLean family supporters, led by Tim's mother, campaigning in the Canadian Parliament to change the law. They wanted to have those found not criminally responsible locked away for life, regardless of their danger to society or how well they responded to treatment. Regardless of which side of the argument you fell on, one thing was for sure. Vincent Lee was caught in the middle. And even though Lee had avoided a prison term, his quality of life was nothing to be envious about. After his admission to the Selkirk Mental Health Center in Manitoba, Lee underwent strict round-the-clock care and was locked down in his room 24 hours a day. According to court testimony from a fellow patient there, being in prison was a better existence. In prison, inmates are allowed to leave their cells, interact with other patients, and hold down a job to buy goods at the prison canteen. Prisoners could also work out at the prison gym or play different games like soccer or volleyball. Inmates could also purchase personal television sets that they could have in their cells to watch anything they wanted. But at Selkirk, such luxuries are out of the question. As a mental patient, things as simple as a walk outside for 15 minutes are huge milestones. According to Lee's fellow patient, those at Selkirk have to spend years getting good evaluation reports before being granted even escorted walks around the grounds. Most of the time, patients do not have interaction with one another. There's also little to do in the way of entertainment, with each floor having just one TV set to one specific channel that never changes. Doctors confirm the patient's accounts, stating that, like a child, patients at Selkirk must demonstrate that the staff can trust them before granting them privileges or even the simplest tasks like taking a walk outside. Because of the strict controls, the public became outraged when news media got wind in 2011 that the review board had granted Lee escorted walks on Selkirk grounds. Many Canadians questioned why Lee should ever be let outside a secure facility. They argued that the only safe place for him was to be locked up 24 hours a day. Proponents for treating the mentally ill argued that Lee responded well to treatment. The review board had seen thousands of patients over the years, and even though it usually took 10 to 15 years of treatment to get to where Lee was in just 2, the board was obligated to act in the best interests of the patient. However, due to overwhelming backlash over security concerns, the board walked back its decision and delayed giving Lee escorted walks around facility grounds. Starting in May 2012, Lee's treatment ignited more media attention when he was granted supervised day passes to local towns. Even though his day passes had to be in the company of a police officer and a staff member, the fact that Lee was allowed free at all caused outrage. 2 years later, local politicians and the media found that the review board had been granting Lee unsupervised day passes ranging from just 30 minutes to a whole day, causing the debate surrounding mentally ill offenders to stir yet again. Opponents argued that the state had objectively failed to separate violent versus nonviolent mentally ill offenders. The fact that a supposed maniac was being allowed unsupervised access to Canadian communities in Manitoba was a huge cause of concern for many people. Tim McLean's mother spearheaded efforts to reform the NCR Act again. With support from local parliamentarians, they drafted legislation that would categorize NCR offenders into 2 groups, with those having committed severe physical violence being differentiated from the rest of the patients. These patients, the legislation proposed, should be locked away for life, while everyone else found not criminally responsible would eventually have the opportunity for release. But despite the media attention and proposed legislation, the review board did not retract its determinations, citing the clear and comprehensive medical evidence that Lee was responding well to treatment. But even though Lee was responding well, the media circus surrounding his case was enough to propel significant changes into Canadian law. Passed in July 2014, the Not Criminally Responsible Reform Act created 2 separate categories of offenders. Those that caused physical harm to another person were lumped into a new category called high-risk NCR. Those found to be high-risk NCR would not automatically be able to be discharged at a review board's recommendations. Instead, a criminal court judge would have to approve the recommendation of the board. By doing this, McLean supporters got a partial victory, and that even though they did not prevent those who had been mentally ill from ever being released, they did make it just that much harder to do so. But for Lee, since Canadian Parliament passed the law after his conviction, the government could not apply it retroactively to him. Instead, at the recommendation of the Review Board, he could be granted a full and unconditional release. However, for the time being, Lee would have to continue doing well in his treatment if he ever wanted that release. Even though he responded well to his medications and therapy, the controversies surrounding Lee's treatment continued into 2015. During this time, the public became aware that he was not only being granted unsupervised day passes, but that he now had a cell phone and was living at a group home near Winnipeg. Lee's medical team responded once more to the outpouring of negative backlash, stating that Lee had not had any hallucinations in over a year and was continuing to make marked improvements in his mental health. His mental health team also noted that due to intense media coverage surrounding his treatment, Lee had been threatened during several of his day passes and that he faced public scrutiny on others. His team argued that though he was out on supervised release, Lee was still vilified in the court of public opinion, making him feel trapped inside imaginary prison walls. Fortunately for Lee, he was able to get a major victory in helping protect himself from threats and harassment out in society. Probably due to the intensely negative media attention, Lee was allowed to legally change his name to Will Lee Baker in 2016. That same year, he was also granted the right to live independently as long as he met certain conditions. These conditions included meeting with counselors, taking his medication, and checking in with medical staff. The news that Lee could now live on his own angered many advocates who wanted to see him locked away for life. Perhaps no one was angrier than McLean's mother. Upon learning that he was living alone, McLean's mother was so outraged, she simply said she was at a loss for words. Others were equally dumbfounded. Some suggested that even if Lee were to continue living on his own, he should be forced to live under type of supervised release for the rest of his life. Detractors argued that even if he had performed well in a hospital environment, Lee living alone with no oversight was too much of a public safety risk. However, the Review Board did not feel the same way. After nearly a year of supervised independent living, on February 6, 2017, the Review Board voted unanimously to grant Lee an unconditional discharge. With this discharge in hand, it meant that finally, after almost 9 years of treatment, Lee would be fully integrated back into Canadian society. No longer would he have to report his address, check in with his mental health team, or even take his medication. While his mental health team reported that they felt encouraged Lee would continue doing the right thing, many still felt otherwise. Despite this, Lee stated that he wanted to spend the next 2 or 3 years in Winnipeg. He also wanted to start a new vocational school for an undisclosed career change. Lee also expressed interest in visiting his native China for the first time in years. Whether or not he did any of these things is unknown. Since being granted a full release, Lee has stayed out of the media coverage, and it appears that those hounding him every step of the way over the years have stopped caring. While the death of Tim McLean is certainly tragic and horrific in every sense of the word, people must not forget that sometimes the perpetrator is also a victim. Vincent Lee never hurt anyone before or since the attack, and he was the victim of modern-day society's failure to treat mental health seriously. Though significant strides have been made in Canada and elsewhere since 2008 in recognizing and treating mental health, there's still a long way to go. Perhaps the greatest question that came out of this case was how to hold people with severe mental illness criminally responsible for their actions. Both sides of the argument agree that these people should have intensive treatment, but the length of their confinement still sparks bitter debate to this day. And while both sides have merit to their arguments, the compromise may be in the middle.
But regardless of the debate, people should never forget that at the core of this case, Tim McLean was a completely innocent victim, and Vincent Lee was a very ill man. When deputies from the Spartanburg County, South Carolina's Sheriff's Department went to the property of Todd Kohlhepp, they did not know what to expect. They were on the hunt for a missing couple whose families had not seen in several months. After months of few leads and not much to go on, the investigators got a break when cell phone records confirmed that their last known location was Todd Kohlhepp's rural 95-acre property. With this evidence in hand, police obtained a search warrant to see if the missing couple was indeed at the property. Soon after arriving at the property, in the corner of woods tucked away not far from Kohlhepp's house, was a shipping container, also known as a Connex box. The Connex box was quite strange. While most might have a single padlock on them, this one had 5 heavy-duty locks all around the front of it. It definitely looked odd. As police started investigating it further, they heard a woman screaming inside, begging for someone to save her. Hearing the woman's screams, police soon obtained a saw that could easily cut through the steel locks and bars, keeping the door shut. The anxiety the police felt was palpable, and they had no idea what awaited them inside. While they had a good idea that at least one innocent woman was trapped inside, they had no idea if there were other victims, or if a madman would also be waiting for them once they opened the door. With the last lock cut, deputies slowly advanced with guns drawn to see what was inside. To their relief, no gunman was lying in wait. The only person inside the Connex box was the missing woman they had been searching for, Kayla Brown. Her and her boyfriend, Charles Carver, had gone missing several months before after answering a job ad posted by Kohlhepp on Craigslist. As police closed in on her, what met them shocked them. Kayla was chained to the floor of the Connex box by a chain attached to a dog collar. Lying on a filthy mattress and clearly having lost a ton of weight, Kayla looked as stressed and gaunt as she'd ever been, but thankful to be alive. Soon after her rescue, Kayla began talking to detectives about what he had done with her boyfriend, Charlie. Even without corroborating what Kayla said next, police already had more than enough evidence to charge him with kidnapping. After arresting him at his home, police officers brought him into the interrogation room, even though he had initially declined to speak with police regarding Kayla's kidnapping. Once Kohlhepp began talking to police at the Spartanburg County Jail, they soon realized that this case was far bigger than just the disappearance of Kayla and Charlie. Kohlhepp confessed to an astounding 7 homicides, and it was only at that time did police realize they had a serial killer on their hands. After this initial confession, police brought him back to headquarters for a formal videotaped confession. While Kohlhepp talked, perhaps what surprised everyone the most was that he simply did not look like a serial killer. Standing at 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighing about 300 pounds, Kohlhepp was a gentle giant of sorts, or at least it seemed so. Trying to figure out how such a man could deceive so many people and fly under the police radar for so long would confuse even the most experienced detectives. In order to better understand how Kohlhepp became the monster he is, it's best to start at the beginning. Born to parents in a rocky marriage in Florida in 1971, Kohlhepp moved around a lot as his mother moved from job to job and relationship to relationship throughout Georgia and Florida. She finally met a man she wanted to marry and wed his stepfather the following year after her divorce. Growing up, Kohlhepp held nothing but disdain for his stepfather. It's unclear why he did this, since there were never any reports or accusations of abuse from the household. Nevertheless, Kohlhepp's mother described him as being just a constantly angry person to be around even as a child. Due to his constant fits of rage, Kohlhepp would smash furniture with a hammer, knock holes in the wall, and cause other destruction inside the house. His anger was so frequent and so constant that each night Kohlhepp's mother resorted to locking him into his room and herself into her own room. Perhaps even scarier than his frequent fits of rage was his obsession with hurting animals. Though Kohlhepp never admitted to these things, in interviews with his mother, she vividly remembers several instances of animal abuse. The one that stuck out the most to her was when he killed his goldfish by pouring Clorox bleach into the fishbowl. When asked why he did it, Kollop responded that he wanted to watch the fish die. Kollop's anger issues extended outside the home too. Because of his quick temper, he isolated all his classmates around him. Because of his inability to make friends and socialize with other students his age, he was actually committed to a psychiatric facility to figure out what was wrong with him. It's unclear what, if any, diagnosis he was given, but after several months was released back into the custody of his mother and stepfather. In 1983, Kollop's mother finally had enough and relented in agreeing to his wishes that he goes to Arizona to live with his biological father. Kollop's mother agreed to this probably because of a few things. Firstly, she was simply tired of dealing with this problem child. Secondly, Kollop still harbored an unadulterated hatred of his stepfather for no apparent reason other than that he was not his biological father. In her mind, sending him to live with his biological father might curb his anger issues and get him to act normal again. Soon after arriving to live in Arizona, he took his father's surname Kollop as his own. It's unclear who his original Samsil surname belonged to, and perhaps this could have caused some of Kollop's resentment towards his mother. Was it her maiden name or a lover's surname? That remains unclear, but if it were a lover's surname, this would explain why he hated his stepfather so much, as he could have blamed him for being the one that forced his biological father out of his life. Regardless of the reason, Kollop soon settled into his new life in Arizona. Though just 12 years old, Kollop worked various jobs to help keep the house afloat, including as a waiter at his father's barbecue restaurant. Life seemed to be getting better for Kollop. Now that he was living with his father, he seemed to calm down and adjusted well to his new environment. At least, at first. As Kollop continued growing up in his adolescent years, his violent sexual urges that psychiatrists noted when he was a young boy started to reemerge. Only now, being bigger and stronger, he could act on these violent urges. They finally came to a head one day when he was just 15 years old. Kollop had sexual fantasies about a fellow classmate of his, and she had continually rebuffed his advances. Kollop convinced the young girl to come over to his house one day under the false pretense that a mutual friend wanted to speak with her. Once at his home, Kollop attacked. He bound, gagged, and raped the young girl. When he was finished, he walked her home just 3 houses down and told her that he would kill her younger siblings if she ever spoke about this. Undeterred by his threats, the girl immediately went to the police and reported her assault and rape. When the police came looking for Kollop, they found him waiting at his house, almost expecting them. Before the police could say or do anything, Kollop apparently uttered the phrase, "So how much time am I going to get for that?" Not surprisingly, he was quickly charged for his assault on his classmate. Numerous court and defense psychologists interviewed him as part of a pre-sentencing report and found him to be a sexually violent predator. In the words of the psychologists, Kollop had no remorse and felt that he would do other such violent acts if given a chance. Because of these findings, the judge accepted his guilty plea, but sentenced him to the maximum punishment he could at the time, 15 years in state prison with no chance of parole. Once he was serving time in prison, though he had a rocky first few years with some minor rules infractions and fighting, Kollop was otherwise a model inmate. He held down a lucrative prison job as a graphic designer as part of the prison work program. He even obtained a Bachelor of Science degree in computer programming as part of a distance learning program a local college had with the prison. Why he was able to change his behavior for the better and become educated while in prison was due to his above-average IQ. As part of his pre-trial tests, his IQ test scored him an impressive 118. While not genius level, it was still impressive and could help explain how this monster was able to hide in plain sight. After serving 14 years of his sentence, he was released from prison and soon moved to South Carolina, where his mother was now living. After getting accepted for a lucrative computer programming and graphic design job, Kohlhepp started saving money and seemed like he was becoming a productive member of society for the first time in his life. However, it was here that his pattern of lies and manipulation showed that it had not gone away because of his prison time. To get this first job, he lied about being incarcerated for the past 14 years and listed the prison company that he worked for while in Arizona. After doing this job for a few years, Kohlhepp decided he wanted to get into real estate. On the state real estate agent's application, he lied about having a felony on his record and was soon approved to hold a real estate license. Probably due to his friendly charm and non-threatening personality, Kohlhepp actually became a very successful real estate agent. He became so successful, in fact, that over the course of the next decade, he built a small real estate empire that had 12 employees and was doing millions of dollars in sales each year. During this time period from 2001 to his arrest in 2016, Kohlhepp had no known interactions with law enforcement. Despite a few civil issues for a bad real estate deal and improper signage, Kohlhepp's interaction with police and the courtroom was non-existent. For all intents and purposes, Kohlhepp was living the American dream. After getting a fresh start, he went to another South Carolina college and pursued a degree in business administration marketing since his Arizona degree did not transfer to the area. He built his own company from scratch and seemed to have a knack for getting friendly with strangers as part of his business. But despite all of these positive factors, something dark still lurked just below the surface of this facade. Anger. In fact, it was anger, he said, that drove him to commit his first confirmed homicides in South Carolina. Once in police custody, Kohlhepp began to confess to all the crimes he'd committed since being back in South Carolina. The first and most notorious of these crimes was the infamous Superbike Motorsports store shooting. On November 6, 2003, a customer walked into the Superbike store on a balmy afternoon to find a scene of absolute horror. The store manager, Brian Lucas, was lying face up in the parking lot, dead from multiple gunshot wounds. Just inside the store, the owner, Scott Ponder, lay face down in the store's showroom. Just inside the door leading to the maintenance bay was Scott's mother, Beverly Guy, who worked as his bookkeeper. Inside the maintenance bay, slumped beside a motorcycle he'd been worked on, was the mechanic for that day, Chris Sherbert. Police soon started looking for the killer. According to the eyewitness that discovered the scene, he had seen a green Ford Ranger driving nearby. His description of the driver was soon plastered all over the media in the hunt for the madman. However, what the witness described was all wrong. The real killer, Kohlhepp, had driven away in an SUV and had never been in contact with the eyewitness. It would not be until 13 years later, when Kohlhepp was arrested for Kayla Brown's kidnapping, that police would finally learn the truth of what happened. Kohlhepp told police it all started when he went in to buy a motorcycle. He said that he had never ridden one before and wanted to buy one. He was hoping that the store employees would be willing to show him how to ride a motorcycle. He claimed during the first encounter that they agreed to show him the basics and let him ride in a field behind the store. According to Kohlhepp, the field was full of chest-high grass and was unsuitable for riding. After going a short distance, Kohlhepp inevitably fell off the motorcycle. Scott, Brian, and other store employees apparently laughed at him. Kohlhepp was apparently embarrassed by this, but still wanted to purchase a motorcycle. He would often go into the store after work or between college classes to sit on some of the bikes and talk to the employees about them. Kohlhepp claimed, in his words, that all the employees there talked shit about him in front of him. Though this irritated him, he still never understood why he kept going back to the store. Nevertheless, Kohlhepp eventually decided to buy a motorcycle from Scott. It was a very nice motorcycle with a powerful engine. Kohlhepp soon had buyer's remorse when the powerful bike was simply too much for him to ride safely or comfortably. Kohlhepp said he went back to the store to return the bike and get a refund of his money. He claims that Scott and Brian laughed at him, stating that they would take the bike back but would not refund him his money. Kohlhepp's situation apparently got even worse when he says that someone stole the motorcycle from outside his home. He said that he filed a police report, paid the $1,000 deductible on the loss, and then went back to the Superbike store. Kohlhepp claimed that he asked Scott and Brian if they would do anything to help him in his situation. Given the circumstances, he was trying to get either a partial refund of the bike's price or a steep discount on another motorcycle. According to him, the duo laughed in his face once more. He also claimed that Scott said, "Don't worry about the bike since this shit is probably already on its way to Florida." The interjection angered Collop and pushed him past his breaking point. Not only had the employees in his mind mocked and made fun of him over the past several months, but they also refused to let him return the bike he bought, and now they were insinuating they had stolen the motorcycle they had sold him. In Collop's version of events, he had enough, and now it was time to take matters into his own hands to avenge these supposed wrongs. On the day that Collop decided to commit the murders, he came during the day when most of the customers would be at work. According to Collop's own words, he wanted to avoid collateral damage on anyone who was not an employee of the store. After doing his usual routine of sitting on the bikes and making small talk, the last customer left. Now it was only Collop and the 4 employees inside the store. After walking around the bike to the open maintenance bay, Collop could see Chris working on a motorcycle. He calmly walked around the motorcycle, drew his gun, and fired twice into his chest. Chris never knew what hit him. At this point, within 2 to 3 seconds, the remaining people in the store rushed toward the maintenance bay, and Collop literally came face to face with them in the doorway. He then shot Scott's mother twice, and then Scott and Brian ran for their lives. Collop emptied his magazine into the 2 remaining men. Scott crumpled into his own showroom floor, while Brian was shot in the main doorway and fell into the parking lot. Collop reloaded his pistol, walked up to Brian, and shot him several more times, including a round to the forehead. He then went back inside and shot each person one more time in the forehead for good measure. Once this was done, he calmly got back into his car and drove home. After getting home, Collop apparently disassembled the gun and put its various pieces into the trash. The barrel went into his cat litter, while the receiver went into the kitchen trash, and so on. And that was the last Collop had thought of the crime until confessing to it 13 years later. Perhaps what's most shocking about his police interview is just how narcissistic Collop truly is. When describing the events leading up to the Superbike shooting, Collop goes into unnecessary details about the firearm he used. While simply stating that he had used a Beretta 92 FS pistol would have sufficed, he continued to go into detail about unrelated facts regarding the handgun. The fact that the extended aftermarket magazines were not available at the time, or that some of these pistols had devices on them to make them shoot faster was unnecessary, and the interviewer had to continually push Collop back on topic. Why Collop would talk about unrelated facts shows that he wants people to know just how smart he is, and that he feels the need to tell police about what all he's done since his crimes have been so perfect no one could have caught him otherwise. Even more disturbing than his twisted sense of reality of trying to convince everyone how smart he is are the words he used to describe the attack itself. After telling police how he shot Chris, he then stated that police would have been so proud he cleared that building in under 30 seconds. While it's hard to believe the police would ever be proud of a murderer, this sick sense of accomplishment and trying to somehow relate to the tactical training law enforcement personnel receive shows that even in this moment, he's trying to win over the police to his side. In describing how he shot each of the victims, he calls the shooting not his best work. Why he would use that term to explain his actions shows how he sees himself as this expertly trained tactical marksman that the police should somehow envy. He also reminds the police 3 or 4 times about how good his reload was when he transitioned from shooting Scott to Brian. While these narcissistic and sick comments are certainly repulsive, they are important for understanding Collop's frame of mind. He sees himself as an incredibly intelligent and easygoing guy with vast knowledge of firearms and experience. He wants everyone to know just how great he is, and that he's just that much smarter than everyone else. The only problem is that the only person who sees Todd Collop like that is Collop himself. To everyone else, he's just a monster who somehow got lucky because he was a chameleon of sorts. It also helped that his remaining crimes took place on a remote piece of property he owned, far from the public's prying eyes. Just along the North Carolina state line, Collop bought an expansive 95-acre property. Consisting of virgin forests, this heavily wooded area was supposed to be Collop's getaway from the world. While that may be true, it also became the tomb for 3 people and the prison for another. When Collop was outfitting his property, along with having an $80,000 fence installed around the perimeter of it, he also had several Connex boxes placed on the property. It was during this time that the infamous Amazon reviews were left. While unknown at the time, the Amazon reviews were discovered after his arrest. While made under an anonymous username, the profile was later confirmed to be linked to Collop's account. On over 130 items from locks to knives to shovels to flashlights, Collop left creepy and, at face value, somewhat sarcastic reviews. For example, under a knife, he wrote that he had not stabbed anyone yet, but that if he ever did, it would be with a quality tool like that one. For a set of locks that the police later found on the Connex box keeping Kayla captive, he said that these locks were great for locking people up. For a small portable shovel, Collop said that it was a great tool for burying bodies. At the time, probably no one thought much of these reviews. People that read them could have just taken them as a sick, off-brand joke. But after police uncovered the totality of his crimes, it quickly became apparent that Collop had not been joking at all. In fact, these comments made in 2014 would soon get put to the test for his next set of crimes in 2015. Why Collop waited to act on his sexual urges and fantasies almost 30 years after his first rape and over a decade after the murders is unclear. Perhaps Collop wanted time to save money to plan the perfect assault and murder. After all, he had been caught after his first attempt, and maybe this time he wanted to ensure he would not be caught. Working for years to save money for a murder property would not be out of the realm of possibility, considering his intelligence and ability to plan crimes ahead of time like the Superbike murders. During his planning stage, after setting up his property, Collop then had to select a victim. Collop was known around town as being creepy, and few women had anything to do with him. In fact, at his favorite Waffle House restaurant in town, he had scared the female waitstaff so much that whenever he came in to eat, a male cook would take his order. It was here that he met his next victim, Megan Lee McCraw Coxey. Megan worked as a waitress at that Waffle House, and like all the other women there, Collop was unsuccessful in winning her over. However, all that would change when he found her walking along the side of the road one day. He said, after approaching her, he felt sorry for her and wanted to help her out. For, you see, Megan had substance abuse issues and mental health problems and was losing custody of her children. Because of this, even though she normally would have never even spoken to Collop, his promise of a job maintaining the property, a place to stay, and some cash was too good of an offer to pass up. After mulling it over with her husband Johnny, they both agreed they would take Collop up on his offer, and he happily agreed. After picking the couple up at a local gas station a week before Christmas of 2015, Collop claims that he took them to his property, where things soon turned sour. According to Collop, Johnny pulled a knife on him and tried to rob him. Collop reacted by getting out of the car and shooting him once in the chest. He then circled around to the passenger side and shot him again. He claimed that when Johnny pulled the knife, that his wife, Megan, did not react at all like she knew they were going to rob him. Because of this, Collop pulled Megan out of the car and held her at gunpoint while he thought of his next move. After calming her down, Collop placed her in handcuffs and led her to the Connex box nearby. He would later claim that this Connex box had always been intended for use as a storage facility for his copious amounts of ammunition. However, his Amazon review posts from the year before would cast doubt on these claims. Once calming Megan down enough to be coherent, he buried Johnny's body. He placed it in the bucket of a tractor he owned, dug a hole, and unceremoniously dumped him inside. He says that this took him the rest of the day. After this was complete, he said he still had no idea what to do with Megan. He was faced with a dilemma here. On one hand, he claimed he did not want her to go to the police, which was probably true. On the other hand, He wanted her gone from his property, which is also probably true. But according to Collop, his plan of getting her away from the property consisted of driving her to Tennessee, dropping her off, and giving her $4,000 to stay away and start a new life. Collop said that Megan was quite happy with the supposed arrangement. However, Collop did not do this immediately, since he needed to get a good weather window for driving such a long distance and time off work to do it. While he waited, he kept Megan locked up in the Connex box. He'd feed her once a day, and each time he would go into the box, she had set something else on fire. Whether it was her mattress, a pillow, a fan, or something, she had destroyed it. Collop became increasingly angry about the fires inside his Connex box. Because of all the ammunition stored there, he did not want it all going off, which was a fair assessment. Whether he was concerned about this or the attention it would draw from police and fire department officials probably also factored into his calculus. After about a week of constantly starting fires from the cigarettes and lighter he had provided her, on or about Christmas Day 2015, Collop finally snapped. He claimed that he went to feed her this time. Not only had she set fire once again to the Connex box, but that she'd destroyed all the ammunition racks inside. Blind with rage over this incident, he took her out of the box and shot her in the back of the head. He then buried her body alongside her husband. Once Collop had committed these murders, he waited for almost a year before striking again. Why he waited is again a mystery and something that only Collop knows. One plausible theory is that he did, in fact, lose control of the situation and wanted to make sure that it did not happen again. What is clear is that he struck again on August 2016. Collop used the same ruse as the last time, but instead placed a job ad on Craigslist. He was interested in a couple that would help maintain his property and keep his house clean. The offer of free rent and a decent paycheck was too much for couple Kayla Brown and Charlie Carver to pass up. They quickly responded to the ad and met Collop at his rural property. According to Collop, the reason why he killed Charlie was because he had a smart mouth. However, the likely reason is that he did not want any resistance and immediately took out the only threat to his safety. After shooting Charlie twice and detaining Kayla like he did Megan, he buried Charlie's body next to the other two victims. Once Kayla was inside the Connex box, her several months of captivity filled with rape, torture, and abuse began. Kayla would later recall that during her captivity, Collop would tell her that he did not believe in rape and that if she did not want to have sex with him, he would just kill her. Of course, to save her own life, Kayla relented to his assaults, if only to make it to the next day. Inside the Connex box, Kayla was kept inside a cage like a diver would use for interacting with sharks. She had a moldy single twin mattress and some small sheets that made her bed inside. Kayla would later recount that most of her days and all of her assaults would happen inside that Connex box. Sometimes Collop would take mercy on her and let her get some fresh air outside. Otherwise, she stayed inside the box. While all this was happening, both their families filed missing persons reports. The investigation into their disappearance went nowhere until some eerie messages started popping up on Charlie's Facebook account. The person claiming to be Charlie stated that he and Kayla were fine. They'd got married and people should no longer look for them. When friends and family questioned the person, the messages they got back were cryptic and evasive. Knowing that someone had been using Charlie's Facebook account to act like him, police were able to obtain a warrant for their cell phone records. Both of their cell phones had last pinged off the tower next to Collop's property. After getting a search warrant to look for the missing couple on Collop's property, 2 months and a week after her disappearance, police heard her screams coming from the Connex box. Once she'd been freed, Kayla immediately told police what had happened, and Collop was soon arrested for her kidnapping, as that was all they could prove at that time. It would be later that day when Collop confessed at the jail, and later that night when he made his videotaped confession at the sheriff's office. But before Collop made his confession, he asked for 3 wishes to be granted. First, he wanted to be able to tell his mother everything that happened first before he confessed to the police. Second, he wanted to give her a photograph. Lastly, He wanted to transfer money to the college fund of a friend's daughter. All these requests were granted in exchange for his confession. Once Collop had confessed, he led police to the makeshift graves of his 3 other victims, whose remains were all recovered like he said they would be. In exchange for taking the death penalty off the table, Collop agreed to plead guilty to 7 homicides, rape, kidnapping, and various other charges. He was sentenced to life without parole plus 60 years for his crimes. But that would not be the end of Collop's story. According to him, he confessed to committing at least 2 other murders in South Carolina and 1 in Arizona. Police have tried to corroborate his stories and even went to a dump site he claimed to have put the 2 bodies, but this search turned up nothing. Police have suspected him of committing other homicides, but as of the publishing of this video, no concrete evidence has tied him to any more victims. This will probably continue to be the case because of who Collop is as a person. If he had really committed any other homicides, he would have bragged to investigators about them.